Next from Springfield, David Yepsen of the Paul Simon Institute and David Ellis, the former chief legal counsel to Speaker Michael Madigan, discussed the issues associated with drawing legislative political boundaries. While many say the districts drawn by political parties result in non-competitive elections, Attorney David Ellis says some reform ideas may cause more problems than they look to resolve. This runs about 30 minutes.
Thank you all for having me here. And it was interesting when I first talked to David, and he said, well, you know, we're having a meeting about reforms, and we need somebody to defend the status quo. And I said, oh, is that me? Am I defending the status quo? I didn't know I was defending the status quo, but we actually settled on a title that I think says careful what you wish for. To me, I would just say, think about what you're doing. And I know that there are some citizen commissions out there, and I am not in a position to say whether they've worked or not, because I haven't studied the empirical results, and I assume you've heard a lot of that tonight. But I would say that theoretically there could be some problems. You know, when I think of a citizen commission, the first word that comes to my mind is accountability, or perhaps lack thereof, political accountability. Yeah, for those of you who know redistricting law, which is probably most of you, you've probably read a lot of Supreme Court cases going back to the 60s about redistricting, and they all say the same thing. They all say, you know, federal courts should be very loath to intrude into the area of redistricting. We can come in to eradicate racial discrimination. We can come in to vindicate the Federal Voting Rights Act. But as a general matter, we stay out. And why do they stay out? They stay out because federal judges are not politically accountable to anybody for the decisions they make. And they say the people who are politically accountable should be the ones who are making these inherently political judgments. You know, if you have a commission that has no political accountability, I would just be concerned about exactly how they're going to make decisions. There are all kinds of policy decisions that have to be made. And I know that in some of these instances, when you create a commission, you make lists. I think I believe that Arizona's has a list of things either in the Constitution or the state law that enables the commission that says the order in which they have to consider. And that's nice. That's fine. But at the end of the day, these things are still going to compete with each other sometimes. And you know, it's one thing to talk about, you know, oh, we can hire a lawyer to tell us how to follow the Voting Rights Act. Yeah, you probably can. But there are going to be all kinds of things dealing with minority voting rights, one person, one vote, where there's going to be judgment calls you have to make, keeping communities of interest intact. And if you leave that to a group that has no political accountability, I just wonder, as a theoretical matter, whether that's the right thing to do. So I guess if I were to summarize the things that I would be cautious about, number one would be, are we sure we're getting what we're asking for? Are we sure we're getting a partisan-free consideration of a map? And then second of all, are we sure that we want unaccountable people to be making these rather sensitive policy judgments? In a nutshell, those would be the two things I would be concerned about if I were thinking about how to do something like this.
How could any of these reforms that have been proposed be any worse than the system we have now? I mean, in the case of the majority party, the party that controls the legislature and the governorship, they go off into a closed room, not a lot of media people, not a lot of transparency, and they draw a plan. Which is sort of the title of our meeting today, Who Controls the Crowds. Right. How are any of these proposals worse than that?
Well, it depends on what you mean by worse.
There's no transparency in the status quo, is there, David?
Well, is it the process or the result that you care the most about?
Well, we're talking process here.
Well, but I mean, you could have a process where God sends down 5 saints from heaven who have no political anything. They don't care about anything to do with politics. They blindfold themselves. They don't get political data. They don't know political data. They don't care about political data. They just draw a map, and the closest thing to a grid-like map that they can. But they end up with a partisan gerrymander. I mean, is that better than people who are politically motivated, but who might, in doing so, actually draw a better map? It's really, what does better mean? How do you define it? Do you define it, first and foremost, as free of partisan bias? I mean, look, I'm not here to tell you guys what to want. I mean, if that's what you want more than anything, something that's completely untainted by partisan bias, there is probably a way you can do it. But are you sure that that's all that you care about? Let me give you an example. Let's say that you have an area of the state, let's just say Illinois. Let's say you've got a congregation of minority voters of the same race, African Americans, okay? And let's say you have less than the number of African Americans in this geographic area are not enough to make a majority of a district. Now, if they were a majority of the district, we all know that the Voting Rights Act would say you have to draw them their own district. You have to keep them together in a district, give them a chance to elect a candidate of their choice. But what if it's less than 50%? What if it's 40%? What do? Well, we know from Bartlett versus Strickland, the Voting Rights Act absolutely does not mandate the drawing of all of those African Americans in one district. It doesn't. That doesn't mean you can't do it. It means that you don't have to. So you're an independent map drawer. You can do whatever you want with that group of people. You could keep them together or you could split them. Now let's say that, let's say that you know the partisan behavior of this group and they're largely Democratic. In Illinois, there's a very high correlation that way, so let's just pretend that they're Democratic. Now let's pretend that next to them is a pocket of people who are very Republican. So now you have a choice. You can say, well, I'd like to keep these African Americans together, regardless of their party, because I want to give them political strength. That's a good thing, right? I think most people would say, yeah, that's a good thing. Or I could split them in half, along with the Republicans right next to them, and draw a north-south district where I have ensured perfect competitiveness of two districts. Now, which one of those results is better? My answer is, it's what you just define as better. I just don't think it's that cut and dry that the only thing we should be concerned about is a lack of partisan bias. It's well-intentioned, but is that the result? Because all that really matters at the end of the day is the map that you draw, not why you drew it or how you drew it. I mean, look, how you drew it is important, obviously, but what really matters, the impact on people's voting rights and all those things, is what the map is when it comes out.
But David, wouldn't, whether you have the current system or a new system, don't both have to comply with the Voting Rights Act?
They do. And so when you're talking about having to comply with the Equal Protection Clause or the Voting Rights Act, that's what I would put down in the category of the easy part. The example I gave you was one where the Voting Rights Act does not say what you have to do. So you have an open, choice to make either one.
Yeah, but you can't pack minority groups together and so they only elect, so they're concentrated in one place, and you can't crack them, and so you dilute their power. I mean, wouldn't that standard apply to either the current way redistricting or to a new reformed?
I don't want to get too bogged down in the legalities, but what I just described to you would not be packing or cracking. It would not be a majority of a minority in one district. So then if you split them, then you're violating the Voting Rights Act. If it's less than 50%, so if it's like in Illinois, if it were like, say, 40,000 people, so that's about 40% of a district. You could do basically under the Voting Rights Act whatever you want with that population. You could split it into 4, you could keep it all together, you could do any variation of those things.
Wouldn't a citizens commission at least be more transparent in dealing with this situation? I mean, you set up a hypothetical. There's one way of doing it in which people get together in an office building in Chicago and
right.
The Democratic majority draws the lines. Or there's a citizens commission in which people get together in an open meeting and have a discussion about this. And the reason I ask that transparency question, David, is in this state there is a real tension between minority groups, African Americans and Hispanics, over some of these issues of how we build these districts.
Yeah, no question about it.
Many Latinos feel like they're being left out, and many black legislators are saying we have to protect our communities of interest. Mm-hmm. So dealing with those questions is a given no matter whose system you use.
Yeah.
Wouldn't a more transparent one be better, more socially desirable?
Maybe, or wouldn't or would the better system be the one where the people who drew the map are politically accountable for their decisions?
At the ballot box?
Yeah.
Is there true political accountability in a system where you have districts that are drawn to protect incumbents?
Well, I don't know that that's the system. I mean, that's not the system that I described. I'm just making the distinction between people who, when they draw their districts, they have to answer to whoever it is they have to answer to, either the voters or the people who are representing the voters. Putting pressure on, don't, draw my district this way or that way. These aren't people who are operating in a vacuum. There's something to be said about operating in a vacuum. I mean, Article 3 federal judges love operating in a vacuum. And I'm sure they think they do everything just fine. But it's, again, what they always say is politically accountable people should be drawing the districts. So if you've got these decisions that are not mandated by federal law, not mandated by the Voting Rights Act, you could pick. Is it more important to you to have a district that protects minority voting rights or two partisanly competitive, 50-50 districts? Who's going to make that decision? Why should it be somebody? Why necessarily should it be somebody who has no political accountability?
Okay, what about an Iowa-type system? When you don't have a commission, you have a computer that draws a map, it goes to the legislature, they vote it up or down. If they vote it down, a computer spits out another map, they vote that up or down. If it goes down, they have a third map that they vote on, but they could amend. What's wrong with that? Isn't that accountability by the people who are elected?
Well, I don't know how a computer could draw a map in compliance with the Voting Rights Act. That is not a pure demographically driven consideration. Determining whether you have to comply with the Voting Rights Act is not just punching numbers into a computer. I mean, Iowa may not have the Voting Rights Act apply to it. I don't know if they have enough minorities.
Yeah, that's too lily white. One other question I had, as you know, the reform groups are ginning up this effort to try to put an initiative on the ballot here in Illinois.
I didn't know that.
There is there's a narrow window in the state constitution, as you know, that says you can have initiative only in cases involving, I think it's the policy and procedure of the legislature. Mm-hmm. In your mind, is it your legal opinion that such an effort to create a citizens commission, would that pass muster with the courts in Illinois, or do you think that goes beyond the scope of that and would be ruled off the ballot?
A constitutional amendment?
Yeah,
to change how we redistrict?
Yes.
And it would amend Article...
I'm not asking whether it's a good idea or not. I'm just asking for your assessment of whether the reform groups are going to be able to... I assume they can get the signatures on their petitions. That's a big assumption. But let's assume that they can and that they're not knocked off the ballot, like is often done in this state. And so it's before the court. Is this missed by the Illinois Constitution, or is it not?
You know what? Unfortunately, I'd have to see the language, because I think what the Supreme Court does is they employ this two-pronged test I think you referenced, form and substance, or process and substance. And I just don't even know what this looks like. So I don't mean to duck the question. I couldn't answer it without seeing it.
Sure. Okay.
Sorry.
Well, let's open this up to other questions from those of you in the audience. George, could we get a...
I feel like a broken record, but I'm curious as to your thoughts of the previous system of multi-member districts, cumulative voting, and compare and contrast that to our current system.
I don't know very much about multi-member districts. I know that our current governor is the one who spearheaded the eradication of multi-member districts. I wonder if he thinks that was a good idea or not. I have heard people say that the eradication of that has concentrated power in the leaders. But really, I don't even remember when that was. Was that in the 70s that we did that? It was, okay, in the 80s, okay, early 80s. So, I wasn't paying attention to our system of government in 1982, so I'm afraid I can't really tell you what it was really like, but that's the criticism you hear, is that it concentrated power, that Republicans and Democrats worked together under the multi-member districts more often because they had more in common regionally. Whether that's a desirable thing or not is really not for me to say, I guess.
Other questions? Yeah, Nicholas.
All right, so you mentioned the importance of accountability for the people that are drawing the district lines.
Yeah.
The classic reformer argument, of course, is that there isn't real accountability because politicians who do line drawing tend to entrench themselves in office. They're not ever held accountable for their decisions at the polls. In fact, they draw the lines so they can't be held accountable. And so I was curious, first, what you make of that argument, but also more broadly, do you oppose any efforts to put any kind of policymaking outside the hands of the legislature. What do you think of the Federal Reserve? The arguments for the Fed are the same as the arguments for independent line-drawing commissions. This is an area where we don't trust incumbent politicians. Let's take interest rates or monetary policy outside of the hands of the legislators. It's the same sort of argument that reformers made for independent redistricting commissions. So I'm curious, what you make of the broader argument for withdrawing any policy issue from the control of the legislature.
Well, I don't know how you can bifurcate the process. I don't know that you can give part of the policymaking to one body and part to the other. I can't even conceive of that. I understand what you're saying about the Federal Reserve, and at the Illinois state level, I don't think that our courts would allow the legislature to give that much policymaking authority to the executive branch, which is the best analogy I can do. The courts here are a little stricter. The separation of powers is a little tighter in Illinois than it is in the federal Constitution, as I've read the case law. But am I opposed to there being any? I'm not really opposed to anything, first of all. If someone has a proposal, I guess I would look at the proposal. I don't know what the proposal is here in Illinois, so I don't really know that I can say I oppose it. But I do think it would be a mistake to try to bifurcate it. I think you got to give it to one body and have them do it. I don't know how you could split that.
Other questions or comments?
I've either bored them to death or disgusted them.
Easy for me to answer, probably. But, the last question that you were asked regarding constitutionality and whether it could pass muster for the Constitution, I read your answer as being yes, it could if the language were precise or if the language were written in such a way that the courts could buy it.
You mean what David asked me?
Yes, you said you couldn't answer because you didn't see the language.
Yeah,
So I was
yeah.
saying, well, does that mean if there is some language that could pass muster?
I wish I had boned up on my constitutional law on constitutional amendments. There's a very specific body of law, and there's not that many cases. There's only 3 or 4. And if my memory serves me, they talk about that when you're amending the legislative article, it has to be both substantive and process-driven. I think that's what it said. And so, and the judicial scrutiny of those is very strict. If I remember. It's very tough to get something on the ballot, as the Supreme Court has interpreted that. So it would be, if I remember all that correctly, and I think I do, then it would be very tough to get something on the ballot that would pass judicial muster. But I don't, until I saw it, I couldn't possibly say, give it a thumbs up or a thumbs down.
Well, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't the court say that the cutback amendment that we just were talking about was permissible?
They must
so if you're
have.
looking for guidance.
They must have, or we wouldn't have cut back.
Right. So that would have been early 80s, or late 70s, early 80s when that was.
Yeah.
Other questions? Peter?
If you're open to more general comments and just observations, I have a couple. One relates to competitiveness and one relates to compactness. On the competitiveness, I wanted to put in a good word for elites. Contrary to what Seth was saying. I think it's true that voters want to live in a district where their representative thinks just like they do. And so the ideal district for the individual voter would be one that was 100% for his party. Totally packed. But the people who don't want those totally representative, but would rather have some competitive districts, tend to be the legislative leaders. Because the leaders can't get anywhere reasoning with elected officials who have a lock on their seat, people with the safe seats. And the leaders are usually trying to do things good for the state, and good for the state as viewed, it will do well for their political party as a whole, although it may not be what these people from safe seats want. So,
You think
I think competitiveness is a good thing, and it is the elites who are in favor of, in the legislature, who are in favor of competitiveness, as well as the ordinary members are in favor of just representation.
You think that people with safe seats are harder to deal with?
Yes, that's what I've heard from legislative leaders.
Because people with safe seats usually feel much more politically independent. they usually feel much more able to stick their neck out on tough votes. The people in the very competitive districts, when it's a very tight Republican-Democrat district, I think you will find if you review voting records that they are far and away the most cautious of voters. On controversial issues, they're least likely to stick their necks out. That'd be my experience.
So we would get better public policy if there weren't these seats?
No, I didn't say that. I was just responding to your statement. Although I do think that this idea of people being, it's not exactly what you were talking about. You made me think of something, though. The idea of people being very close to their incumbent, is it really such a bad thing to take that into account? If you don't worry so much about partisanship, but you just look at the fact that you've got a rep or a senator who's been there for a long time and is very good and has an extremely good relationship with their constituents, is that an impermissible thing to consider? That there might be, I mean, what if you're an independent redistricting commission and you get a petition signed by 30,000 people that say, please keep Representative Jones as our rep because we love her, she's very good to us. Do you ignore that and say, no, I want a competitive district, so I'm going to cut those people out? I mean, is it really such a terrible idea to consider the incumbent constituent relationships? I'm not sure that it's always a bad idea. Maybe sometimes it is. I don't think you were saying that, sir, but I'm just making the comment.
Other questions or comments? Yes, over here, David.
This may sound really simplistic, but it seems to me that if we were to agree that it's a political process, that redistricting is a political process, and that there should be political accountability, which I think is what you're saying, and if transparency is very, very important, like the commission system does, why wouldn't we just try to increase the transparency of the political process instead of being in a back room in some whatever? Why wouldn't we keep that part of the process but have it be much more open? And my guess is if it was much more open and was handled the way that the commission process is handled or was handled, I can't remember if it was in California or Arizona, my guess is that things might be done a little differently if people were watching.
Yeah, I don't think that's simplistic. I think that's probably true. I don't hear a lot of people arguing against transparency. I don't argue against transparency.
Why don't we do it then?
Well, I don't know. We probably had about 25 legislative hearings when we drew the 2011 map in Illinois. I think we had 25 in the House, and somewhere between 20 and 25. I think the Senate had more than we did. If you mean actually while people are up there with the map and their computers and trying to do it and have everyone looking over their shoulder, I mean,
Yes.
I'm not sure that would be particularly workable, but, okay.
Well,
sure.
but a public hearing over something that's a done deal is really not meaningful public input.
Okay,
yeah, it's exactly what she's saying. I mean, go ahead, keep the current system of drawing district lines, but somehow open it up so people can see
sure.
how this process goes.
Sure.
All right, Brad?
David, a couple points that I want to make. Again, through the work of the Simon Institute, they took broad polling, which shows that average ordinary citizens by 70% would like to have a different redistricting process. So it's not the elites that are interested in this, it's your average ordinary citizen. And you made my point that I was going to as they were bringing the mic over, is the transparency needs to be after the maps are drawn so that there can be adequate time for meaningful public input on the maps, and that didn't occur after the last redistricting process.
Don?
I'd like to start with an observation that we shouldn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good in this process. Just because we can't get a perfect plan doesn't mean we shouldn't move from what we've got, which I think most of us think is somewhat flawed, to something that might be potentially better. That's where I'd like to reiterate what you were asking earlier. Granted that the Iowa plan doesn't have to deal with the Voting Rights Act, but the technocrats in the Legislative Service Bureau are smart people, they're competent people, and I'm sure that if we had minority concentrations in Iowa, they could figure out how to carve out those districts, and then you could use the same principles we use for the rest of the districts that don't have those problems. And Illinois could do the same thing.
I want to ask David one last question, and then we got to wrap it up. It's been a long day. David, you're a student of politics in this state. You've worked in the process. I mean, it's clear Illinois has some problems. Wouldn't you at least agree with that? I mean, there's a low public trust. You've got legislators, some who are under indictment. You've had, the whole thing with 2 governors. I mean, it's a long list of things. Okay, the state has problems, if we can agree on that. I'd like your prescription. Well, you're a good lawyer, a successful lawyer, a great writer. I mean, what do you see in groups who have lit upon this idea of redistricting reform as a way to fix a lot of other problems in this state? If that's not the way to go, what are your thoughts for how we improve the quality and performance of government in Illinois?
Well, I mean, I've been asked
some other tree these folks ought to be barking up?
No, to me, usually when I get asked this question, it's about our governors, especially after Blagojevich, and I was associated with that, and everyone said, 2 governors in a row, how do you fix that? And, my response to that is probably not very interesting or exciting to a reform crowd, but it is, the voters need to be better informed, because, it was, I think that we had a very bad gubernatorial race that led to Rod Blagojevich's first election. He raised a lot of money. He hit his Republican opponent before, like the day after she won the primary, he was running negative ads. Right. I think we had an extremely uninformed electorate, because I was not surprised about Rod Blagojevich. I didn't vote for him because I was afraid he just judging from everything I had come to learn about him, didn't seem like the greatest of guys. But too many people either vote for someone because of they're a political party or because they sound good on TV, and people don't dig down enough. And it's just getting, to me, it's getting worse. I watch cable shows because I'm kind of a news junkie, probably like a lot of people in this room, news and political junkie. And you listen to these people on TV, and it's just all sound bites, and they're just saying these few rote things all the time. It's so hard to get meaningful public policy discussion either on television, a little bit more on radio. And everybody is getting polarized in the media just like they're getting polarized in the elections. It's very frustrating to me, because I think the real way to do this is for citizens to talk to each other, whether it's on the radio or in public forums, whatever, and get better informed about these people who are running for office.
David, I want to thank you for coming here. You said you felt like you were walking into a den of lions.
I did.
I hope it wasn't that bad.
No, not at all.
But we do appreciate your carving out time, coming down here to do this, and thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.